war on drugs started in the 1930s but officially began during Richard Nixon's presidency. Nixon, in June 1971, declared drugs public enemy number one as a part of the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. Many blacks and anti-Vietnam War youths did not support Nixon. Because of this, he made them seem to be an enemy of America. He did this by associating them with different types of deadly drugs. The tragedy of the war on drugs was addiction, death, and the oppression of people who did not support Nixon. Although it has not been completed yet, people are trying to triumph over this oppression even now.
On October 27, 1970, Congress passed the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. The Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act provided increased research into and prevention of drug abuse and drug dependence. It also provided treatment and rehabilitation of drug abusers and drug-dependent people and to strengthen existing law enforcement authority in the field of drug abuse.
In 1971, Nixon declared war on drugs in his following speech.
And I would like to summarize for you the meeting that I have just had with the bipartisan leaders, which began at 8 o'clock and was completed 2 hours later. I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive. This will be a worldwide offensive dealing with the problems of sources of supply as well as Americans who may be stationed abroad wherever they are in the world. It will be government-wide, pulling together the 9 different fragmented areas within the government in which this problem is now being handled. And it will be nationwide in terms of a new educational program that we trust will result from the discussions that we have had. With regard to this offensive, it is necessary first to have a new organization. And the new organization will be within the White House. Dr. Jaffe, who will be one of the briefers here today, will be the man directly responsible. He will report directly to me. And he will have the responsibility to take all of the government agencies, 9, that deal with the problems of rehabilitation, in which his primary responsibilities will be research and education, and see that they work not at cross purposes, but work together in dealing with the problem.
One of Nixon's campaign managers, John Ehrlichman, said the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing them both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
There were many effects that occurred after the declaration of the war on drugs and the Watergate scandal. An almost immediate impact of the war on drugs was the anti-drug parents movement. A parent was troubled by the presence of marijuana at her 13-year-old daughter's birthday party, and as a result, Keith Schuckert and his neighbor Sue Rush formed Families in Action. It was the first parents' organization designed to fit teenage drug abuse. A separate organization called NORML also formed after the war on drugs began. Founded by Keith Stroop, NORML stands for the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws and lobbies for the decriminalization of marijuana. In 1974, Nixon was required to resign. The Watergate scandal began in June of 1972. Several people broke into the Democratic National Committee located in Washington, D.C. The people arrested were connected to Nixon's re-election campaign. President Nixon took great lengths to cover up the scandal. Nixon resigned in 1974. By the time Nixon resigned, he had 3 articles of impeachment against him for obstruction of justice, abuse of presidential powers, and the hindrance of the impeachment process.
Good morning. This is Today in Washington, Friday, August 9th. The nation awaits the swearing in at noon Eastern Time of our 38th President, Gerald Ford, and the departure from political life of Richard M. Nixon. In a televised farewell last night, President Nixon acknowledged that because of the Watergate affair, he no longer has a strong enough base in Congress to continue with any effectiveness.
His resignation as the 37th President of the United States takes effect at noon today, Eastern Time, and at that moment, in the Oval Office, Vice President Gerald Ford will be sworn in as the 38th Chief Executive. There is here in Washington a great sense of relief and hope that the turmoil of the last 2 years is over at last. Here is part of what the President said in his resignation speech last night.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as President, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time President and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress.
Immediately after Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford was inducted into the presidency. Ford had a firm stance on the sale of hard drugs. When he became president, the sale of hard drugs increased again. Ford directed all agencies of the federal government to step up law enforcement against the sale of these drugs. He had Congress enact mandatory fixed sentences for people convicted of federal crimes involving the sale of hard drugs. Hard drugs degrade the spirit as it destroys the body of their users. As a result, Congress enacted a 5-year minimum sentence if anyone was in possession of 4 ounces of heroin, as well as mandatory sentencing for federal drug offenders. Some effects of the war on drugs were more long-lasting. For example, the Drug Enforcement Administration was established. President Nixon set up a super agency to handle all the aspects of the drug problem. The DEA consolidates with agents from the BNDD, Customs, the CIA, and the ODALE. Another long-term effect is the oppression of minorities. Black men are sent to state prisons on drug charges 13 times at the rate of white men doing the same crimes. According to the Global Commission on Drug Policy, arresting and incarcerating people fills prisons and destroys lives, but does not reduce the availability of illicit drugs or the power of criminal organizations. More than 25.4 million Americans have been arrested on drug charges since 1980. About 1/3 of them were black, even though they only make up 12% of the U.S. population. An organization that is trying to fight the war on drugs is the American Civil Liberties Union. The ACLU's campaign for smart justice is working across the country to combat racial disparities in the criminal justice system and reduce the U.S. jail and prison population. The organization fights against the war on drugs because the United States incarcerates too many people for too long and for the wrong reasons. The tragedy of the war on drugs was the addiction, death, and oppression of people who do not support Nixon. Although it has not been completed yet, people are still trying to triumph over this oppression, even now.